My name is Laura Booth, and I am a captain in the United States Army. To the world, I'm a decorated officer, but in my own family, I'm just a disappointment. Last Christmas Eve, at my family's home in Virginia, my father, General Harrison Booth, raised his glass. In front of my brother, my sister, and everyone, he looked at me and declared, his voice as sharp as a blade, "Maverick brings in wealth. Savannah brings in prestige. And Laura? She just brings home her uniform to be laundered and a salary paid for by the taxpayers. You are not an asset to this family. You are an over-glorified public servant." That was the moment the soldier in me finally took over. Before I tell you exactly how I used my meaningless career to expose my family's financial truths, right at that dinner table, let me know where you're listening from. And if you've ever had your entire life's work dismissed by the one person whose approval you craved most, hit that like button. This story is for us. Growing up, I learned that in the Booth family, you were either a trophy or a tool. That night, I decided I would become a weapon. The scene was a perfect lie, a Christmas card image of upper-class Southern comfort in Richmond, Virginia. The grand fireplace in the living room crackled with seasoned oak, spitting embers against the brass screen. A towering Fraser fir stood in the corner, heavy with years of heirloom ornaments and twinkling white lights, its pine scent mingling with the rich aroma of my mother's cooking. The dining table was a masterpiece of tradition. A 20-pound turkey roasted to a perfect golden brown, mashed potatoes so creamy they were almost liquid, and a deep, crimson cranberry sauce that shimmered in the candlelight. I sat there in a cream-colored wool dress, a costume I wore once a year to play the part of the daughter who fit in. I performed my role with practiced precision. "Mom, the turkey is incredible this year. So moist," I said, and she gave me a fleeting, grateful smile. "Maverick, how is the new downtown office coming along?" I asked my brother, who was a partner at a private equity firm. "Closing deals, Laura. Big ones," he replied, not even looking up from his plate. My smile felt like a mask hardening on my face. Every year, it was the same. I was an outsider in my own home, a foreign dignitary visiting a land where I didn't speak the language of stock portfolios or charity galas. I braced myself for the inevitable comment from my father, the verbal jab that always came. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. It was an immutable law of nature in the Booth household, as certain as the sun rising in the east. The first strike came disguised as a conversation. I was making a genuine effort, trying to share a piece of my world. "I just finished an advanced data analytics course at Fort Meade," I began, feeling a small spark of pride. "It's incredible how we can predict hostile movements based on—" My father cut me off, not with anger, but with a dismissive wave of his hand. He turned his entire body toward Maverick. "Son, tell me about the market. I hear tech stocks are volatile. What's your play?" He clapped Maverick on the shoulder. "Those are the numbers that matter, Maverick, the real battles." It felt like an invisible hand had slapped me across the face. The air grew thick and heavy. Across the table, Maverick's wife, Jessica, shot me a quick glance. It was an expression of perfectly crafted pity, the kind a woman gives when she's secretly thrilled not to be you. She then turned and placed her hand over Maverick's, squeezing it with a look of immense pride, a silent gesture that screamed the difference between a winner and a loser. My mother, Eleanor, ever the frantic peacekeeper, jumped in. "The weather is supposed to be lovely tomorrow, isn't it? Perhaps a white Christmas after all." Her attempt was so weak, so transparent, it only amplified the crushing silence that followed. The main event, however, was always my father's traditional Christmas toast. He stood, glass of bourbon in hand, the patriarch surveying his kingdom. He praised Maverick for his killer instinct on Wall Street. He praised my sister, Savannah, a lawyer, for a high-profile case she'd won, enhancing the family's reputation for excellence. He even praised my youngest sister, Piper, for her grades at UVA. It was Piper, in her innocence, who set the stage for my execution. "What about Laura, Dad?" she asked, her voice bright and clear. The entire table fell silent. My father turned his gaze to me. His eyes, the same blue as my own, were as cold and unforgiving as a winter sky, He held my gaze for a moment, letting the silence stretch, letting everyone feel the weight of my exclusion. Then, he delivered the verdict. "Laura," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "Maverick brings in wealth. Savannah brings in prestige. And Laura? She just brings home her uniform to be laundered and a salary paid for by the taxpayers." He paused, letting the words sink in, twisting the knife. "You are not an asset to this family. You are an over-glorified public servant." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. No one moved. No one spoke. I saw a slow, satisfied smirk creep across Maverick's face. I heard Savannah let out a long, weary sigh, as if my very existence was an inconvenience. My blood ran hot, rushing to my face, and a low ringing started in my ears, drowning out the crackle of the fire. The bite of turkey and mashed potatoes in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash, bitter and foul. But I did not cry. I did not scream. Years of military discipline took over, locking my emotions behind a wall of ice. The soldier in me stood at attention while the daughter in me shattered. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my knife and fork down on the porcelain plate. The sound, a sharp click-clack, cut through the suffocating silence. It was a small sound, but in that room, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a declaration. I rose from my chair, my movements measured and calm. I pushed my chair neatly back under the table. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was perfectly even, without a tremor, a chilling monotone that made my mother flinch. I turned and walked away, my back straight, my head held high. I did not look at my mother's stunned face or my father's gathering rage. I just walked. The heavy dining room door swung shut behind me, and only then, standing alone in the cold foyer, did I allow myself to breathe. The frigid air of the Virginia night flooded my lungs as I pulled the front door open. But it was nothing compared to the ice that had just formed around my heart. As I drove away from the house, the sterile blue light of the dashboard did little to warm the freezing air inside my car. My father's words, "Over-glorified public servant," echoed in the silence, each syllable a fresh cut. A public servant. Was that all I was to them? A line item on a federal budget? The truth is, I was much more than that. I was their secret benefactor, their emergency fund. I was the silent, invisible bank of the Booth family. The memory that surfaced first was the most painful. 2 years ago, my phone had buzzed in my barracks in the Middle East. It was Maverick. His voice, usually so confident and slick, was ragged with panic. "Laura, I'm going to lose everything," he sobbed into the phone, the sound tinny and desperate from halfway across the world. He had made a high-risk bet on a biotech startup, and it had imploded, taking a massive chunk of his client's money with it. My reputation, my job, everything. Dad will kill me. He wasn't the brilliant investor then. He was just my big brother, terrified and broken. I had just received a significant combat bonus for a successful intelligence operation. Without a second thought, I wired him nearly my entire life's savings. It was over $80,000. I told myself it was what a sister does. You show up, you save them. A few weeks later, I was home on leave, attending a backyard barbecue at the house. I stood by the grill, nursing a beer, and overheard Maverick holding court with his friends. He was back to his old self, smug, charming, a king in his kingdom. "The key is having a killer instinct," he boasted, puffing on a cigar. "You can't be afraid to go for the jugular." When everyone else was panicking, I saw an opportunity. Doubled down, pulled it out of the fire. He never mentioned me. He never said thank you. I was just a footnote in the story of his own genius. He had taken my sacrifice and rebranded it as his success. Then there was my father. The word public servant felt especially cruel coming from him, because he was my most consistent client. His emails never started with, "How are you?" or "Are you safe?" They were masterpieces of subtle manipulation. An email with the subject line, "Family upkeep," would arrive in my inbox. Inside, he'd write about the rising costs of maintaining the Booth family's standing in the community, or the unexpected repairs needed for the sailboat. They were never direct requests. They were statements of fact. delivered with the expectation that I would read between the lines and do my duty. And I always did. I quietly transferred the money for his country club membership dues. I paid for the new sail on his boat, the Savannah. And a week later, I'd see him quoted in an alumni magazine for the Citadel, talking about the importance of honor and self-reliance in the modern age. The hypocrisy was so profound it made my stomach turn. He was using my taxpayer-funded salary to subsidize his lifestyle, all while publicly scorning my choice to serve. And Piper, my youngest sister, she treated me less like a sister and more like an ATM with a security clearance. When she decided she needed a luxury apartment downtown that was well beyond her entry-level marketing salary, I was the one who covered the security deposit and first month's rent. It was an early birthday gift. When she wanted to backpack through Europe with her friends after graduation, I funded the trip. A Christmas present. The sharpest sting came last year. She posted a photo on Instagram, posing with a brand new designer handbag. A Celine, I think. It cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. The caption read, "Feeling so spoiled. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for always indulging your baby girl." I had worked 3 consecutive weekend duties to afford that bag for her. 3 weekends of staring at satellite imagery and writing reports, all so she could have that moment. I looked at the picture, at her smiling face, and my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed out a simple, hollow comment. "Looks beautiful, Pipes." My reward was a single, emotionless, like notification on my phone a few hours later. My contribution, my sacrifice, erased and credited to someone else. I remember one person seeing it all clearly. My boyfriend, Elias. He's a good man. A high school history teacher from a blue-collar family in Pennsylvania. He couldn't wrap his head around my family's dynamics. We were at my parents' house for the 4th of July once, and he watched me write a check to my father for new tires for the Lexus. Later that night, he took my hand. "Laura, they don't respect you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't owe them this. You're enabling them." He was right, of course, but back then, I was still clinging to a foolish, childish hope. The hope that if I just gave enough, if I was just useful enough, if I sacrificed enough in silence, one day they would turn around and finally see me. Not the public servant, not the ATM, but me. Laura? Their daughter. Their sister. Just a few months ago, one of my own soldiers, a young private from the mountains of Appalachia, came to me for financial advice. He was a kid, barely 19, and he was sending his entire paycheck home every month to support his parents and younger siblings. His only concern was how to set up the allotment so it was secure. I sat with him for an hour, helping him create a budget, showing him how to keep a small portion for himself. The pure, uncomplicated love behind his sacrifice was humbling. He was sending his money home to people who needed it, who were grateful for it. I was sending my money home to people who took it, spent it, and then despised me for earning it the way I did. Hit the like button if you've ever been the silent fixer in your family, the one everyone calls in a crisis, but no one remembers to thank. And in the comments, just type the word bank if you know what it feels like to be treated like an institution instead of a person. That Christmas night proved, with brutal finality, just how tragically wrong I had been. Hope hadn't just faded. It had been publicly executed at the dinner table. And as the cold Virginia air filled my lungs, a new, chilling question began to form in the silence of my mind. Why? Why had I allowed myself to become their private, invisible bank for all these years? The question of why I had allowed myself to become their bank haunted me for weeks. And since I didn't have an answer, I did what any soldier would do when faced with an unsolvable problem. I retreated to the fortress I knew best, my work. After that Christmas, I didn't just go back to my job at Fort Meade, I disappeared into it. It became my sanctuary and my escape. My life became a series of long, grueling nights bathed in the cold blue glow of computer monitors. My world shrank to the size of a secure intelligence facility, a place where the chaotic emotions of family life couldn't touch me. Here, there was only data, patterns, and the relentless pursuit of logic. I would spend 12, sometimes 16 hours at a stretch, my eyes burning as I analyzed enemy communication intercepts from halfway around the world, searching for the whispers, the anomalies, the digital breadcrumbs that could mean the difference between life and death for a platoon on the ground. Dinner was whatever the vending machine offered: stale chips, a chalky protein bar. Sleep was a luxury I often couldn't afford, and I'd frequently wake up with the imprint of my keyboard on my cheek, my neck stiff from dozing off in my chair. But in that exhaustion, I found a strange kind of peace. Data didn't lie. It didn't have ulterior motives. It couldn't gaslight you or make you feel small. In the clean, orderly world of intelligence analysis, there was a truth and a clarity I never found at my family's dinner table. In that world, I wasn't the over-glorified public servant. I was Captain Booth. My name carried weight. Junior analysts would stop by my desk, their faces etched with uncertainty, holding a piece of raw intelligence they couldn't decipher. "Captain, can you take a look at this?" they'd ask. "We're not seeing the pattern." And I would. My commanding officers, men and women who had seen combat and bore the scars of command, trusted me. They gave me the most sensitive, the most critical tasks because they knew I would deliver. I remember one afternoon, standing in a sterile, windowless briefing room, the air humming with the sound of servers. The room was filled with senior officers, colonels, and majors, their faces grim. I was the lowest-ranking officer there. I stood before a massive screen, a laser pointer in my hand, and for 30 minutes, I laid out my analysis of a complex insurgent network. My voice was steady, my arguments were clear, my conclusions were irrefutable. I pointed to connections they had missed, to vulnerabilities they hadn't seen. In that room, my value wasn't measured by my brother's bank account or my sister's social standing. It was measured by the sharpness of my mind and the quality of my work. Here, I was an asset. The pinnacle of this new life came 6 months after that disastrous Christmas. My unit had successfully dismantled a major threat thanks in large part to the intelligence I had provided. For my contribution, I was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal. I stood at attention on the parade ground, the sun hot on my face, my dress uniform perfectly pressed. A 2-star general pinned the medal to my chest, the cool metal a heavy, solid weight. He shook my hand firmly. "Outstanding work, Captain," he said, his voice gruff with approval. My colleagues patted me on the back, offering sincere congratulations. "Well-deserved, Booth. Buy you a beer tonight." And yet, in the midst of this professional triumph, a hollow ache spread through my chest. It was a strange, disorienting emptiness. A few days before the ceremony, I had sent a simple email to my family. "Just wanted to let you know I'll be receiving a medal on Friday. It's a pretty big honor." I wasn't expecting them to fly in, but I had hoped for something. A phone call, maybe. The only reply I received was a 1-line text from my mother, hours later. "That's wonderful, honey. Mom is proud of you." Nothing from my father, nothing from Maverick or Savannah. The silence from them was louder than all the applause from my peers. This medal, this tangible proof of my worth and dedication, felt strangely incomplete. It couldn't fill the void that was carved out for a family's pride. After the ceremony, my commanding officer, Colonel Miller, called me into his office. He was a quiet, weathered man who had spent 30 years in the Army, with eyes that saw more than you wanted them to. I expected a formal congratulations. Instead, he gestured for me to sit down. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. "I didn't just call you in here for the medal, Booth," he said, his voice low, "though you damn well earned it." He picked up a file from his desk. My file. "I've read your service record. West Point graduate, top of your class, distinguished service." He looked up at me. "Your father is General Harrison Booth, isn't he? I served with him years ago. A soldier of the old guard." I just nodded, my stomach tightening. Colonel Miller leaned forward, his gaze direct and piercing. "Listen to me, Captain. Don't ever let anyone, family or otherwise, tell you that the work you do with your mind isn't important. Those soldiers in the field, the ones getting all the glory, they survive because of brains like yours back here. They go home to their families because of the battles you fight in a dark room at 2 in the morning. His words hit me harder than the metal. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. For the first time, someone had looked past the uniform and seen the soldier, had looked past my last name and seen me. He saw the quiet, lonely war I was fighting on two fronts, one for my country and one inside my own heart. It was the validation of one soldier to another, a lifeline thrown to me in a sea of indifference. It was the first time I realized that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the values you defend together. Colonel Miller's words were a comfort, but they couldn't erase the deep chill that had settled in my bones since Christmas. For the next few weeks, I existed in a self-imposed exile. My phone would ring with calls from my mother, my sister, even Maverick, but I ignored them all. The thought of hearing their voices, pretending that nothing had happened, was more than I could bear. I was an island, and I was pulling up the bridges. Elias, bless his heart, never pushed. He saw the fortress I was building around myself and didn't try to storm the walls. Instead, he just made sure I knew he was on the other side, waiting. One evening, as we were quietly watching a movie in my small apartment, he turned to me. "Hey," he said softly. "Thanksgiving is next month. A few of us are putting together a little Friendsgiving at my place. It's a potluck, super low-key." He paused, his eyes kind. "No pressure at all, but if you want to come, there's always a seat for you." The invitation was so simple, so free of expectation. It wasn't a demand or a guilt trip. It was just an open door. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a small, fragile sliver of hope pushed its way through the ice. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. And the words felt like the first breath after being underwater for too long. Elias's apartment wasn't the grand, stately home I grew up in. It was a cozy, slightly cluttered two-bedroom in a neighborhood where you could actually hear your neighbor's music. The dining table was a clever combination of his actual table, a coffee table, and a sturdy folding table he'd borrowed. There was no fine china, no polished silver. We ate off paper plates. But the atmosphere, it was everything my family's holidays were not. It was warm, it was real. The small apartment was packed with people and buzzed with laughter. Everyone had brought a dish, creating a chaotic but delicious buffet of green bean casserole, sweet potato pie, and multiple versions of stuffing. We teased Elias mercilessly about his turkey, which was, admittedly, a little dry. More importantly, people listened to each other. They asked questions and waited for the answers. As the evening wore on, we went around the makeshift table, sharing what we were thankful for. When it was my turn, I hesitated. My mind was a minefield of bitterness and hurt. What could I possibly say? Then I looked around the room, at the faces of soldiers, veterans, and their partners, people who understood a world my family never could. "I'm thankful," I said, my voice a little thick, "for my brothers and sisters in arms." A murmur of understanding went through the room. Heads nodded. No one judged me. No one compared my contribution to anyone else's. In that moment, I wasn't General Booth's disappointing daughter. I was one of them. I belonged. Later, I stepped out onto the small balcony for a breath of crisp autumn air. A moment later, Sergeant Eva Rostova, a fiercely loyal NCO from my unit, joined me. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman with a wicked sense of humor and a heart of gold. She handed me a bottle of Sam Adams. "You're looking better, Captain," she said, her voice direct as always. "Less like you're about to analyze the whole world into submission." I managed a small smile, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I told her everything. About Christmas Eve. About my father's words, Maverick's betrayal, the whole ugly mess. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she didn't offer a single word of empty comfort. She took a long sip of her beer. "Your family," she said bluntly, "sounds like a bunch of parasites in designer clothes." She looked me straight in the eye. "You know that, right, ma'am? The only question is when you're going to decide to cut them off." Her harshness was a splash of cold water, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. It wasn't pity, it was a diagnosis. She was giving me permission to be angry, validating the rage I had been suppressing for so long. Just before I left, Colonel Miller and his wife, who had also been invited, pulled me aside. His wife, a graceful woman named Catherine, with warm, intelligent eyes, took both of my hands in hers. She was the kind of woman my mother always tried to emulate, effortlessly elegant, universally respected in the tight-knit military community. "Laura," she said, her voice gentle but strong. "My husband has told me so much about your work, about the lives you save with your intelligence and your dedication." She squeezed my hands. "I just wanted to thank you. Thank you for your service. What you do is so incredibly important." And that's when the dam broke. Tears I didn't even know were there started streaming down my face. To hear those words, "What you do is important," from her, a woman whose approval my own mother craved, was overwhelming. It was everything I'd ever wanted to hear from my own family, a simple acknowledgement of my worth, and it was being given to me by a near stranger in the hallway of a crowded apartment. It was the kindest, most painful gift I had ever received. I drove home that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The warmth of that imperfect, wonderful evening stayed with me. For the first time, I understood that family wasn't about the house you grew up in or the name you carried. It was about the people who gave you a seat at their table, paper plates and all, and made you feel seen. I walked into my apartment, my heart feeling lighter, fuller. I kicked off my shoes and was about to make a cup of tea when my phone, silent for weeks, buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen. The name displayed was Mom. And just like that, the cold came rushing back in. The warmth of that Friendsgiving evening lingered for a few days, a fragile shield against the cold reality of my family. But I knew it wouldn't last. A truce built on silence is never a truce at all. It's just a ceasefire, a holding pattern before the next inevitable conflict. It came, as I knew it would, in the form of a phone call from my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some lingering sense of duty made me answer. "Laura, darling, I'm so glad I caught you," she chirped. Her voice was unnaturally sweet, like honey laced with something I couldn't quite identify. It was the voice she used when she wanted something. An immediate red flag went up. She didn't mention Christmas. She didn't ask why I hadn't been answering her calls. She dove straight into a carefully rehearsed script. It was all about Maverick. He was on the verge of a massive business opportunity, she explained, but there was a minor hiccup with a potential partner. "The family just needs a little bit of your special help, honey," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. My blood ran cold. I knew this playbook. "What kind of help, Mom?" I asked, my own voice flat, devoid of warmth. "Oh, it's just a small thing, dear," she said evasively. "Your father can explain it better. Let me put him on." The trap was set. I heard the rustle of the phone being passed, and then my father's voice filled my ear, not with a greeting, but with the familiar tone of command. It was the voice of a general addressing a subordinate, not a father speaking to his daughter. "Laura," he began, dispensing with pleasantries, "Maverick needs you to run a background check on a business associate. The man seems untrustworthy. You have access to systems. Use them. I want to know everything about him. Financials, connections, any dirt you can find. I want it done quickly and quietly." I stood frozen in my kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The world seemed to slow down. He wasn't asking. He was ordering. He was ordering me to commit a federal crime, a felony that would not only end my career in disgrace, but could land me in Fort Leavenworth, the military prison. Everything I had worked for, every oath I had sworn, he was telling me to throw it all away for one of Maverick's business deals. "Dad, I can't do that," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to keep it steady. That's illegal." The explosion on the other end of the line was instantaneous. "Don't you talk to me about illegal," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "I'm talking about family. The honor of the Booth name is on the line. This man could ruin your brother." He wasn't just yelling, he was deploying his ultimate weapon, manipulation, cloaked in the language of duty. "You took an oath to protect this country, Laura. Are you telling me you can't use those skills to protect your own family? Or has that desk job of yours made you soft?" He was twisting my oath, the most sacred vow I had ever made, into a weapon to be used against me. He was framing my integrity as a weakness, my refusal to break the law as a betrayal of my blood. It was a masterful, toxic, and utterly cruel maneuver. In his world, family honor was a shield to hide behind, a justification for any action, no matter how corrupt. My honor, the actual, disciplined, lawful honor I lived by every single day, was just an inconvenience to him. I took a deep breath, the anger starting to burn away the shock. My answer is no, I said, my voice clearer now, stronger. I will not abuse my position. I will not break the law for Maverick or for anyone. There was a moment of dead silence on the line. When my father spoke again, the rage was gone. It had been replaced by something far more terrifying. Ice. His voice was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of emotion. Fine, he said, the single word dripping with contempt. If you've chosen the government over your own flesh and blood, so be it. He let the threat hang in the air for a beat before delivering the final blow. I have some old friends at the Pentagon, Laura, men who still take my calls. Let's see how far your spotless career goes when they hear that Captain Booth turns her back on her own father in his time of need. The line went dead. He had hung up. But the threat remained, echoing in the silence of my apartment. It was no longer about control. It was about destruction. He was willing to burn my entire life to the ground simply because I would not obey. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall, the phone still in my hand. My fingers were trembling, my knuckles white. But it wasn't from fear. The love, the hope, the desperate need for his approval that had driven me for 32 years had been incinerated in that single, chilling threat. All that was left in its place was a pure, unadulterated rage. A rage so clean and so absolute it felt like clarity. After my father hung up, I didn't move. The pure, white-hot rage that had flared up inside me cooled into something heavy and paralyzing. I sank onto my sofa, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering onto the floor. The sun had set, and my apartment was cast in shadow, the darkness outside mirroring the numbness I felt within. He had threatened to destroy me, my own father. For years, I had endured the dismissals, the insults, the financial burdens. But this was different. This was a declaration of war. I sat there in the dark, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, my thumb swiping past meaningless headlines and curated photos of happy lives. Then, I stopped. A clip of a speaker I vaguely recognized popped up on my feed. It was Brené Brown. I almost scrolled past, but something made me press play. She was talking about boundaries, about courage. And then she said the words that would change everything for me. Clear is kind, she said, looking directly into the camera. Unclear is unkind. Clear is kind. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. All my life, I had been unclear. My silence, my quiet compliance, my hope that they would someday understand without me having to say a word. I had called it keeping the peace. I had called it being the bigger person. But it wasn't kind. It was deeply unkind to myself. It was permission. It was allowing them to define my worth, to use me, to threaten me, all while I swallowed my truth. A switch flipped inside my head. The paralysis broke. I stood up and walked over to the wall, my hand finding the light switch. I flicked it on, flooding the room with light, banishing the shadows. The numbness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just in the arena now, I was going to fight. I didn't wait for them to call me back to apologize or pretend nothing happened. This time, I was initiating contact. I opened my laptop and composed a new email. The recipient list was short: my father, my mother, Maverick, Savannah, and Piper. The subject line was blunt: urgent family meeting. The body of the email was even more direct. We need to talk. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern, via video call. Attendance is mandatory for everyone. I hit send. There was no love, no sincerely, just my name. Captain Laura Booth. The tone, so different from my usual conciliatory emails, must have shocked them. Within an hour, I had 5 separate replies, all confirming. They probably thought I had caved, that I was ready to crawl back and beg for forgiveness. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. The next night, at precisely 8 p.m., I logged on. One by one, their faces populated the screen in little boxes. My father, leaning back in his leather office chair, the picture of patriarchal authority. My mother, looking nervous, wringing her hands just out of frame. Maverick, smirking, already looking bored. Savannah and Piper, merely curious spectators to the latest family drama. I let the silence hang for a moment, observing them. They were waiting for me to speak, for me to crumble. I did not. With the calm precision of an intelligence officer delivering a battlefield assessment, I began. My eyes found my father's box on the screen. "I recorded our phone call yesterday, General," I said. The use of his title made him sit up straighter. "Your request was not only a solicitation to commit a felony, it was a profound insult to the uniform that both of us have worn." His face began to darken with rage, but I didn't give him time to speak. I moved my gaze to the next box. "Maverick," I said, my voice level. "You are not a Wall Street genius. You are a gambler who I bailed out to the tune of $80,000. The killer instinct you brag about was funded by my combat pay." Maverick's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. I shifted my focus. "Mom," I said, and for the first time my voice wavered slightly, but I pushed through. "Your silence was never peacekeeping. It was complicity. Every time you changed the subject or pretended not to hear, you co-signed their behavior." I laid it all out. The country club dues, the sailboat repairs, the designer handbag for Piper, paid for with my overtime. Every secret transaction, every quiet sacrifice, every dismissive comment. I turned their hidden history into a public record. The silence that followed was absolute. They were all frozen, caught in the glare of a truth they had never been forced to confront. My father finally found his voice, his face purple with rage. "You ungrateful!" "I'm not finished," I cut him off, my voice now as cold and sharp as steel. "As of this moment, the Bank of Laura Booth is permanently closed. All financial support, in any form, has ended. Effective immediately." I let that sink in. Then I delivered my final, non-negotiable term. "And if I hear so much as a whisper of a threat against my career," I said, locking eyes with my father's image on the screen, "I will ensure that the full audio recording of our conversation is delivered to your friends at the Pentagon, along with itemized bank statements of every dollar I have ever sent this family for the last 10 years. Am I being clear?" I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't need one. Their shocked, horrified faces were answer enough. "Have a good evening," I said, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that like button if you believe that speaking your truth, no matter how hard, is the ultimate act of power. And if you've ever had a mic drop moment of your own where you finally stood up for yourself, just type "my turn" in the comments below. Let's celebrate that strength together. Then I moved my cursor to the red button on the screen and ended the call, leaving them alone with nothing but a black screen and the wreckage of their own making. For the first time in my life, I was the one who hung up first. Ending that call felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. The initial rush of adrenaline gave way to the cold, hard reality of what I had just done. I hadn't just stood up for myself, I had declared war on my own family. And my father was a general who knew how to fight. Words were not enough. A threat was only as good as the action you were prepared to take to back it up. I needed a weapon, and more importantly, I needed a strategy. My mind went to the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I remembered one of her famous quotes: "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for a principle. To do that, I needed an ally who understood the rules of this particular battlefield. The next morning, I was on a train to Washington, D.C. My search for legal counsel was targeted and specific. I needed someone who specialized in complex family disputes, but also understood the unique culture and laws of the military. My research led me to one name, Evelyn Reed. A former colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the Army's legal arm, she was now one of DC's most formidable litigators, known for her sharp mind and take-no-prisoners approach. Her office, just a few blocks from the Capitol, was sleek and modern, all glass and steel. It was intimidating, but Ms. Reed herself was not. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of calm authority that I immediately recognized and respected. She didn't offer fake sympathies or platitudes. She just gestured to a chair and said, "Captain Booth, please, begin." And for the first time, I told the entire story to a complete stranger. But I didn't tell it like a victim. I presented it like an intelligence briefing. I had spent the entire night before compiling my evidence. On her large conference table, I laid out my laptop and began. I showed her the Excel spreadsheets, meticulously organized, detailing every single financial transaction for the past 10 years. Each line item included the date, the amount, the recipient, and the stated reason. Maverick's investment emergency, my father's club dues, Piper's birthday gift. I showed her the archive of my father's emails, highlighting the carefully worded phrases that were his veiled requests for money. I showed her the screenshots of Piper's social media posts, flaunting gifts I'd paid for. And finally, I took a deep breath and pressed play on the audio file from the night before. I watched Evelyn Reed's face as my father's voice, first demanding, then manipulative, then threatening, filled the quiet, elegant office. She listened to the entire recording without a flicker of emotion on her face. Her expression was a perfect poker face, impossible to read. When the recording ended and the silence returned, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. What if she didn't believe me? What if she thought I was just another entitled daughter with a family squabble? Evelyn leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. She looked at the mountain of evidence I had presented, then she looked at me. "Captain Booth," she said, her voice calm and measured. "This is not a family drama. This is a documented systemic pattern of financial abuse, coercion, and extortion." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with mine. "And we are going to handle it." The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost brought me to my knees. It was validation. It was confirmation from a seasoned, objective professional that I was not crazy, I was not ungrateful, and I was not wrong. I had found my ally. A few days later, an even more unexpected alliance emerged. My phone rang, and the caller ID read, "Savannah." I almost declined the call, bracing myself for a barrage of anger and accusations. But curiosity got the better of me. Her voice, when I answered, was not angry. It was hesitant, uncertain, and laced with something I had never heard from her before. Shame. "Laura," she started, then paused. I was on that call. I heard the recording you played." Another pause. "I had no idea it was that bad. I knew Dad was tough on you, and that Maverick was, well, Maverick. But I didn't know about the money, not all of it, and I didn't know Dad threatened you." I said nothing, just listened. "Look," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "I can't help with the money. You know my situation. But if you need a witness, if you need someone to confirm the way you've been treated, the things that were said over the years, I'll do it." It was the first time in my entire life my sister had ever taken my side. An alliance was forming from within the enemy's own ranks. At our next meeting, Evelyn Reed laid out the battle plan. It was brilliant in its simplicity and aggression. "We will not be filing a lawsuit immediately," she explained, pacing slowly in front of her office window. "That's a defensive move. It's what they would expect. It would drag on for years and get messy." She stopped and turned to me. "Instead, we are going to launch a preemptive strike. We will draft a formal mediation and settlement demand. In it, we will list every single transaction from your files. I've reviewed them, and many of the transfers to your brother, without any formal agreement, can legally be defined as undocumented personal loans, not gifts. We will demand a structured repayment plan. Furthermore, the document will include a formal cease and desist order against any and all contact that could be perceived as threatening or coercive, citing the recording as evidence. She gave me a thin, confident smile. This strategy achieves two things. First, it puts them on the back foot. They will be forced to react to our terms, not the other way around. Second, it shifts the entire power dynamic. We are no longer asking for respect. We are demanding accountability. Listening to her, I felt the last vestiges of the victim fall away. This wasn't just about getting my money back, or even about getting an apology. This was about reclaiming my power. I was no longer on defense. I was on the attack. The day of the mediation felt less like a family meeting and more like a pre-combat briefing. Evelyn Reed's conference room was a modern, sterile battlefield of glass and chrome overlooking the gray, imposing architecture of Washington, D.C. The air was cold and smelled faintly of expensive leather. This was not a place for emotions. It was a place for verdicts. I sat beside Evelyn, dressed in a sharp, dark navy pantsuit that felt more like armor than clothing. Across the polished mahogany table sat the opposition. My father, General Harrison Booth, was flanked by his lawyer, an old friend of his from the golf club named Arthur Vance. The general sat ramrod straight, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in a mask of indignation. My brother, Maverick, sat next to him, trying to project an air of nonchalant boredom. But the constant nervous glances he shot at his own lawyer betrayed him. And my mother. She just stared down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, a portrait of quiet misery. The air was thick with a hostility so palpable you could almost taste it. This wasn't a reunion. It was a ceasefire negotiation, and they had come to demand my unconditional surrender. Arthur Vance, a man with a booming voice and the self-assured demeanor of someone who has never been told no, kicked things off. He launched into a condescending monologue about the sanctity of family, the natural friction between generations, and how this was all just a sad misunderstanding brought on by a daughter who has always been a little too sensitive. Evelyn let him talk. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on a thick binder in front of her, letting him exhaust his supply of patronizing clichés. I watched him, and I felt nothing but a cold, distant pity. He had no idea what was coming. When Arthur finally wound down, Evelyn didn't respond to his sermon. She simply pushed the thick binder toward the center of the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice cutting through the stale air like a surgeon's scalpel. "We are not here today to discuss feelings. We are here to discuss the numbers inside this binder." She paused, her eyes sweeping over my father and Maverick before landing back on their lawyer. "And we are here to discuss Title 18, Section 875 of the U.S. Federal Code, which pertains to the act of interstate extortion." The room went completely, utterly silent. The color drained from Arthur Vance's face. Maverick, who had been slouched in his chair, suddenly sat bolt upright. My father's eyes narrowed into slits of fury. The attack had begun. With the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, Evelyn began to dissect my family's finances. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts were her weapon. On May 14, 2021, she began, Captain Booth transferred $83,000 to Mr. Booth, here, for what was described in text messages as a business emergency. We have classified this as an undocumented personal loan. She went on, item by item. On August 2nd, a transfer of $5,000 to General Booth for country club dues. On December 20th, a transfer of $12,000 for sailboat maintenance. With each entry, she presented printed copies of bank statements, emails, and text messages. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful, self-reliant Booth family was being systematically dismantled, piece by painful piece, right before my eyes. Maverick's lawyer was now pale, whispering furiously into my brother's ear. Then Evelyn came to the final exhibit. She looked directly at my father. "And then there is the matter of the phone call on November 28th, she said calmly. She didn't play the recording. She just let the thread of it hang in the air. in which a demand was made for a serving military officer to commit a felony, followed by a direct threat to her career upon her refusal. We have that recording, of course. That was the breaking point. The general's iron self-control finally shattered. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He shot to his feet, his finger jabbing through the air, aimed at me. "She owes us!" he roared, his face a mask of purple rage. "Everything she is, everything she has is because of the Booth name. We made her." The room held its breath. This was it. The final desperate stand of a falling tyrant. Evelyn Reed didn't flinch. She slowly raised her eyes from her papers and met my father's furious gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was still calm, but it carried the weight of absolute victory. "On the contrary, General," she said, the formal title a deliberate, professional courtesy that was also a subtle insult. "According to our calculations, the Booth family is, in fact, indebted to Captain Booth for the precise amount of $273,450, excluding interest." She let the number settle in the room, a bomb that had just detonated in silence. "We are not, however, asking for full repayment," she continued smoothly. "We are demanding two things. 1. A formal written apology from every member of your family present. And 2. A legally binding agreement to cease and desist from any future threats or coercive contact." She leaned back, her work done. "Or," she concluded, her voice dropping ever so slightly, "we can simply see you in federal court." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of a king being checkmated, the sound of power shifting, the sound of my own chains finally breaking. It was the sound of winning. Leaving Evelyn Reed's office that day, I expected to feel triumphant, elated, vindicated. Instead, I just felt empty. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a profound and hollow exhaustion. Elias was waiting for me in the lobby, and when he saw my face, he didn't ask if I'd won. He just opened his arms and held me, a silent, steady anchor in the storm that had just passed. Victory, I discovered, has a bitter aftertaste. I had won the battle. I had reclaimed my dignity and my power. But in doing so, I had formalized the death of my family. It wasn't a family I would miss, not the one that had sat in that conference room, but I found myself mourning the one I'd always wished for, the illusion I'd carried for so long. The price of my freedom was accepting that it was gone forever. That night, sleep was a stranger. I sat by my window for hours, watching the distant city lights, contemplating the fallout. The written apologies arrived by courier 2 days later, as stipulated. They were stiff, formal documents, clearly drafted by lawyers, devoid of any genuine remorse. My father's was a single, typed sentence on his personal letterhead. Maverick's was barely coherent. They were the spoils of war, but they felt like ash in my hands. A few weeks later, my mother asked to meet me for coffee. I agreed, driven by a curiosity I couldn't explain. We met at a quiet cafe, a neutral territory. She looked older, the polished veneer she always wore now cracked with fine lines of stress. The circles under her eyes were darker. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to justify anyone's behavior. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed genuine. "I'm sorry, Laura," she said, her voice quiet. "I failed you. As a mother, I failed." She told me that the house had become a mausoleum of silence. My father hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in weeks, retreating into his study like a wounded animal. Maverick's wife, Jessica, had taken their children and moved in with her parents, and the word divorce was now being spoken out loud. The empire my father had prized above all else, the image of the perfect, powerful Booth family, was crumbling. Our conversation didn't magically heal 30 years of wounds, but it was honest. For the first time, she wasn't the general's wife. She was just a woman admitting her own weakness. "I was never brave enough to be the mother you deserved," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "But you've shown me what real strength looks like." It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a beginning. a small doorway to a new, more honest relationship. Maverick sought me out a week after that. He found me at a park near my apartment where I sometimes go to run. He didn't look like a Wall Street titan anymore. He looked tired, defeated, and deeply bitter. "Are you happy now?" he spat, the words heavy with resentment. "You've destroyed everything." I looked at my brother, the man I had once saved, and I felt no anger, only a profound sense of pity. "No, Maverick," I replied, my voice calm. "I didn't destroy it, I just turned on the lights. It was already broken." He stood there, waiting for me to demand the money, to gloat, to say something that would let him feel justified in his anger. I didn't. I had already won what mattered. The money had never been the point. All I had ever wanted was for them to see me. He couldn't bring himself to say he was sorry, but his silence, his inability to meet my gaze, was its own kind of confession. In the weeks that followed, the anger I had carried for so long began to feel like a heavy weight. It had served its purpose. It had fueled my fight. But now, the war was over. And carrying it further was only poisoning me. I started reading about Nelson Mandela, about how he had found it in himself to forgive his captors after decades of imprisonment. I came across a quote from him that lodged itself in my heart. "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." I realized then that my final battle wasn't with my family. It was with myself. The anger was my prison now, and I was the only one holding the key. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat down at my desk with a pen and a single sheet of paper. I began to write a letter. "Dear Dad," I wrote. I wrote about the little girl who had idolized him, who had joined the army just to feel a fraction of his pride. I wrote about the pain of being perpetually invisible, of having my life's work dismissed as a novelty. I wrote about the phone call, the threat, and the moment he broke what was left of my heart. And then, I wrote the hardest words of all. "I forgive you." I wasn't writing them for him. He would never see this letter. He didn't deserve the peace these words might offer. I wrote them for me. I forgave him for his weakness, for his inability to love a daughter who didn't fit into his narrow definition of success. I forgave him for the expectations he had crushed me with. I forgave him because I deserved to be free. And finally, I wrote one last line. "And I forgive myself for taking so long to learn my own worth." I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope with no address, and placed it in a box in the back of my closet. I didn't burn it. It wasn't something to be destroyed. It was a monument, a quiet paper monument to the war I had survived and the peace I had finally, painstakingly, built for myself. It's Christmas Eve again, 1 year later. But this is not the same world, and I am not the same woman. Elias and I are in our own apartment, a warm, bright space that feels like us. A small, fragrant balsam fir stands in the corner, decorated not with heavy heirlooms of a past I don't claim, but with simple wooden ornaments and lights that we chose together. The soft, mellow notes of a Vince Guaraldi Trio album play from a small speaker, and the air is thick with the sweet, spicy scent of the gingerbread cookies we've just pulled from the oven. There is no tension, no judgment. There is only a quiet, easy peace. Elias, now my fiancé, comes up behind me and wraps his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. We stand there for a moment, just watching the lights on the tree blink. It's a simple moment, but it feels more real, more profound than any of the grand, hollow Christmases of my past. My phone buzzes on the kitchen counter. For a split second, an old ghost of anxiety flickers within me, a muscle memory of dread. But it vanishes as quickly as it came. I pick it up. It's a video call from my mother. I answer, and her face appears on the screen, smiling. Behind her, I can see Savannah and Piper, their hands dusted with flour, laughing as they decorate cookies at her kitchen island. "Merry Christmas, you two," my mother says, her voice bright and genuine. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I reply, and Elias echoes the sentiment. We chat for a few minutes, a light, easy conversation about the weather and cookie recipes. It's not a long call. It's not a deep call. But it's real. My father and Maverick are not there. Some rifts are too deep to ever fully close. But the relationship I have now with my mother and sisters is a new one. built on honesty and carefully respected boundaries. It isn't perfect, but it's true. Before she hangs up, my mother shares a small story. She tells me that my father has recently been reading books about modern warfare and intelligence. She said she found him one evening in his study, staring into the fire. He turned to her and mumbled, almost to himself, "That work Laura does. It's more complicated than I thought." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't meant for me to hear. But coming from a man like General Harrison Booth, it was a tectonic shift. A year ago, those words would have been everything to me. Now, hearing them secondhand, I just smile. I don't need his validation anymore, but I'm glad, for his sake, that he's found some small measure of understanding. A few months ago, I stood on a stage, my own promotion ceremony. The silver oak leaf of a major was pinned to my uniform. After the official proceedings, I was unexpectedly asked to say a few words to the younger officers in attendance. Standing at that podium, looking out at their young, eager faces, I didn't talk about strategy or geopolitics. I talked about a different kind of war. Integrity, I began, my voice clear and steady, is not just something you practice on the battlefield. It begins long before that. It begins in your own home. It begins with the lines you refuse to cross and in how you allow others to treat you. I didn't use any names. I didn't have to. "Never let anyone," I said, making eye contact with a young female lieutenant in the front row. "No matter their rank or their bloodline, define your worth. Your value is not determined by their approval. It is forged in your own commitment to honor, to truth, and to the oath you swore." When I finished, there wasn't immediate applause. There was a moment of profound, respectful silence. Then, the room erupted in a wave of applause that felt more meaningful than any medal I'd ever received. In that moment, I realized I'd found my true voice, not just as a soldier, but as a leader. The story ends here, on a quiet autumn afternoon. Elias and I are walking hand in hand through a park in DC, the leaves crunching under our feet, the air crisp and clean. The setting sun paints the sky in shades of orange and purple. My father wrote his will for me on that Christmas Eve 2 years ago. It was a verbal last will and testament that left me with nothing, that wrote me out of the family legacy. But in the aftermath of that war, I finally wrote a will of my own. It isn't written on paper, and there are no assets to divide. My legacy isn't in stocks or property. My legacy is the peace I fought to win. My legacy is the strength I found to say no. And my legacy is the unwavering belief that the worth of a soldier, of a daughter, of any human being, is not given to you by others. It is, and always has been, something that comes from within. And to you, for walking this path with me, thank you. My story has reached its peaceful new beginning, but I know it's just one of many out there. My father's will was about what I wasn't. The one I wrote for myself is about who I am. I hope my journey inspires you to honor your own. If stories of resilience, integrity, and the courage to draw your own boundaries are what you seek, be sure to follow or subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel. There are more stories like this one waiting for us to explore together. Until then, go write your own.